I never thought much about the old stories our grandparents used to tell us, those eerie tales of cursed places and forgotten villages hidden deep in the forest. My family had always brushed them off as just that, stories. But I learned the hard way that sometimes those stories aren't just tales, they're warnings. It all started when my cousin Liam and I decided to go on a hiking trip through the woods behind our family's cabin. The forest had always been our playground when we were younger, but as we got older, we'd stopped going there as often. We had grown up with stories about the forest, how people used to disappear in the woods, how the trees seemed to have a mind of their own, how the wind whispered things you weren't supposed to hear, but none of that seemed real to us. We thought they were just the ramblings of old people. This particular trip was meant to be nothing more than a fun weekend hike. We packed our bags with supplies, water, snacks, and a few camping tools, and set out on the trail. It was late spring, and the weather was perfect for hiking. The forest was alive with the colors of blooming flowers and the sounds of birds singing high in the trees. We ventured deeper into the woods than we had ever gone before. The trail we were on was marked, but it soon faded into an overgrown path that seemed less traveled. The further we went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, the rustle of leaves, died down, and the air grew thick and still. It felt as though the forest was holding its breath. Around noon, we came upon something that made us stop in our tracks. A clearing. It was strange because it didn't look like any of the other clearings we had passed. This one was too perfect. The grass was neatly trimmed like it had been tended to, and in the center stood the remnants of old stone buildings. It was a small village, though it didn't look like any village we had ever seen. The stones were weathered and covered in moss, the buildings crumbling as though they had been abandoned for centuries. Curiosity got the better of us, and we made our way into the village. It was an eerie sight. Empty streets, broken windows, and doorways that led to nothing but darkness. It felt like we had stumbled upon a place that time had forgotten. We didn't speak much, just exchanged glances, both of us feeling a little uneasy, but neither wanting to admit it. We started exploring the village, walking past old houses, what might have been a town square, and a small chapel at the edge of the village. It didn't take long before we found something that set us on edge. In the middle of the town square, there was a large weathered stone with strange symbols carved into it. The symbols looked ancient, as if they had been made long before the village was abandoned. We couldn't make sense of them, but the sight of them made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Liam wanted to take a closer look, but I stopped him. Something about the stone felt wrong, like it wasn't just a forgotten relic, but something that should not be disturbed. He, however, insisted, and being the adventurous type, he stepped up to touch it. The moment his hand made contact with the stone, the air around us seemed to change. The temperature dropped, and an unnatural silence fell over the village. It was as if all the sounds of the forest had been swallowed up by the stillness. I turned to Liam, but his face had gone pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I listened, but I didn't hear anything. No birds, no rustling of leaves, nothing. Just an eerie silence, thick and suffocating. "Liam," I said, my voice low. "Let's go. Now." But before I could move, I saw it, a shadow moving in the distance. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then it moved again, unmistakably human in shape, but too fast, too fluid to be real. I grabbed Liam's arm, pulling him toward me. "We need to leave, now." But as we turned to run, something stopped us. The air had grown thick, heavier than before, and we couldn't breathe properly. Our legs felt like they were dragging through mud. The village seemed to be closing in around us, the buildings leaning toward us like they were alive. The sense of being watched grew stronger, more oppressive, and I could hear something faint, distant, but growing louder with each passing second. A low chant, a rhythmic hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We tried to run, but no matter which direction we went in, we couldn't escape. The village stretched on endlessly, twisting and warping, its streets becoming unfamiliar, like the place itself was shifting around us. The feeling of being trapped was overwhelming. The air was thick with a strange, earthy scent, like wet soil and something decayed. I looked at Liam. He was pale, his eyes wide with terror. What's happening? What is this place? I didn't have an answer. The only thing I could think of was to get out, to find a way back to the forest. But it was as if the forest itself had disappeared. The trees were no longer where they had been. The path we had come on was gone, replaced by more empty streets. That's when we heard it, the sound of footsteps behind us, slow and deliberate. I spun around, but there was nothing there, nothing but the empty village. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued, getting closer and closer, until I felt the breath on the back of my neck. I turned again, this time fully expecting to see something, but there was still nothing. But the feeling of being watched, of being pursued, was palpable. I grabbed Liam's hand and we ran blindly, not knowing where we were going or how we were going to escape. We stumbled upon the chapel at the edge of the village. It was a small, dark building with an old wooden door that creaked as I pulled it open. Inside, it was pitch black, and the air smelled damp, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. We stepped inside, but before we could even gather our bearings, the door slammed shut behind us. And then, we saw them. Figures, shadows, moving in the darkness. They were tall, thin, and somehow wrong. They stood just outside the doorway, watching us with empty eyes. Their faces were gaunt, their limbs unnaturally long. They made no sound, but the air around them seemed to vibrate with an energy I couldn't understand. We didn't wait for them to approach. We bolted out of the chapel, our hearts racing. But the village had changed. The streets were darker now, the buildings more oppressive. We were no longer in control. We were no longer leading the way. It felt like hours before we finally stumbled out of the village, through a thick wall of trees, back to the main trail. When we looked behind us, the village had vanished. The trees were as they had always been, and there was no sign of the stone buildings or the figures we had seen. It was as though it had never been there at all. We didn't speak a word to each other as we made our way back to the cabin. The only sounds we could hear were our own hurried breaths and the pounding of our hearts. By the time we reached the cabin, it was dusk, and the forest was silent again, as if nothing had ever happened. Neither of us has spoken of that day since, but we both know what we saw. The forgotten village is real, and it exists somewhere deep in the woods, a place that should never be found, a place that time has erased, but the forest still remembers. And every time I walk through those woods now, I can't help but feel the eyes of something watching me, waiting for the next person foolish enough to stumble upon the village. If you ever find yourself out in the woods, lost and alone, just remember, there are places